Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thanks very much for joining. We will slowly start to the conversation, although some people are still joining. But very warm welcome to every one of you, of course, that have been following us during all the sessions, and in particular to our guest speaker for today, Bruno Dobrusin, who is a coordinator with our public transport program of the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF. Bruno is from Argentina and has been working with the Online Academy in the past. So we're really, really happy to have him in our session today. And he's sitting in Canada and working for the Global Trade Union of Transport Workers. We're very, very happy to have you, Bruno, today. There have been lots of comments under your video lecture, which was more concerned with the challenges facing the public transport. But today we want to have the conversation looking both at the challenges but also at the vision of the ITF when it comes to the public transport. So it would be really helpful if you can give us kind of some key highlights that you think are important just for us to open up the conversation. We can have that for about 9-10 minutes, and then we open up for people to make questions. So everyone, please make sure you write your name and the country you're from, and take note of your questions. You either put it in the chat or you take the floor. So thanks again, Bruno, and over to you.
Thank you, Elida. Hi, everyone. Good to see a lot of familiar faces. Good to see you all. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for joining us. For me, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you because, as Elida said, I used to also do part of the work of the Online Academy, so it's always a pleasure to be part of this. And I'm also a GLUE alumni, so these spaces for me are really important and I value them a lot. So I appreciate all of you connecting. Some of you I know it's late at night. I see Benji over there late in the Philippines probably. So anyways, good to see you all. I guess I'm going to speak a little bit about what, just reinforcing the messages and discussions that we have in the public transport section of the Futures Public course that is currently running on iVersity on the GLUE platform. And as I'm going to highlight two things. So one is first, just reinforce a bit on the message of what are some of the main challenges that we have right now on public transport. But then I also just want to focus on what are some of the key proposals that we have from the ITF side, from the transport unions from around the world. And then I'm just happy to bounce back discussions with you and questions, comments that you may have. I saw a lot of comments on the page itself, so I'm also happy to pick up some of those. So just to recap a little bit, main challenges we have today in public transport around the world, I would say we have multiple, but I'm going to highlight two. One, which perhaps many of you are familiar, is the issue of funding. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of supportive funding, especially in the global north, to public transport systems to keep them running, to be able to maintain a basic level, especially for people that were considered the heroes of the pandemic, that had to continue to go to work, that worked in healthcare, that worked in the factories that didn't close, etc. And in the global south, it's a different situation because more often than not, there was no funding available. So informal transport continued to run. Sometimes defying those orders to shut down, sometimes with some tacit agreement from governments, but we saw a very different situation. What we're seeing today is a drying up of the funding that was going in the global north, and not a lot of funding happening for systems in the global south. What this often means is that it leads to systems of privatization of public transport. That's one of the big concerns that we have, and I think it's a recurring theme in the course, in the Futurist Public course, that defunding public services makes a worse service, makes people be more frustrated with the service that they are supposed to get that is essential to fulfill their rights, and leads to a system of privatization. In public transport is sometimes not so easy to see because it's often mixed models, what we call private-public partnerships, PPPs. And it takes the form of, for example, your public transport authority may still have the name of the system that they're running. It may still be the Metropolitan Transport Authority or whatever the name it has, but it's actually a concession to a private operator that runs for profit, that tries to increase fares all the time, that does not provide good working conditions often, that tries to outsource as much of the workforce as possible. So you start seeing things like the cleaning stuff gets outsourced, the ticketing vending stuff gets outsourced, the safety or security personnel it's outsourced to private firms, and all those workers stop being part of the main transport company. And often this leads to also a problem for the services. So we get less services for higher fares. That's often what's happening. So it creates a big problem for workers. It creates a big problem for passengers. So I think that's one of the key issues that we're seeing now in terms of funding and how this is translated to fares. The other part is that we're also having, like every other sector, a big problem with the issue of climate change. And in public transport, it comes in mainly two ways. One is how extreme weather events are affecting public transport systems. So today, for example, if you operate a subway in a large coastal city, flooding is a very common problem that you're going to have. It's a very common problem for the workers, for the passengers, and often there is not enough. It relates to the funding issue because there's not enough thinking and funding towards trying to adapt to those new conditions. When there is funding to adapt, it's often not fully incorporated to the operations of the system. So, for example, we see a lot of electric buses. I think most countries around the world are now seeing some form of electrification of their public transport, and it is very related to the climate crisis. The issue, again, with that is that many times we buy new vehicles that are electrified, but for that countries get in debt, or sometimes it's in the form of loans from the manufacturers, but there's not enough funding for the operations of those units, and that also kind of reinforces the process of privatization. Um, so those are two things that I wanted to highlight that perhaps are very familiar or may not be from your realities, and I'm happy to also hear what's happening in your places. But what basically this leads to a system where we're slowly losing control of our public transport and become both more dependent on private companies, but also more dependent on external funding in order to be able to make that transition to clean electrified vehicles, for example. So what are some of the proposals of the ITF, of the International Transport Workers Federation? I'm going to highlight a few that are especially touched upon by Alana Dave, who is the director of our department, and it's in her video as well, where she comments on some of these proposals. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the 6 points that we have in what is called the People's Public Transport Policy, which the idea is, how do we want to run our public transport if we could just decide it collectively, right? And it has 6 points. And I'm just going to quickly mention them. But the first one is public ownership. And public ownership is key, not just because we have to be able to control as a community, as a country, as a government, a system that is so important to fulfill people's rights. Remember that we have a right to transport. It guarantees the right to the city for so many people. So we need public ownership. But for us, it's very important to reinforce that this is not just the ownership of the system, but we also need to be able to operate it as a public good. What does that mean? Essentially, that we cannot depend on having a profit logic to run our public transport. If you have a public transport system that is run on the logic that it should make money for a private operator, or even if they should make money for a public operator, then we're in a problem there. Because the priority should be that the public transport system guarantees people's trips from one place to the next without depending whether we're making extra money out of that or not, whether we're making a profit or not. So that's essential. Why do I say that sometimes public transport systems are also run for profit, and that's a problem. Publicly owned companies should not be running for profit, but many times there are different pressures that come into play, and companies tend to also take a private logic, even though they're publicly owned and operated. So the subway, for example, in Santiago, which is the other video that we have in the session, The subway in Santiago is a publicly owned subway that it's run mostly as a private corporation, unfortunately, but just to give you an example. What are the other points that we have in this vision? We need public financing. So again, a lot of the public transport that we're seeing today is actually being financed through loans. And what we argue is that we need public funding, and that's why we need to have a more fair taxation system. And I'm sure that you've seen this in the other videos in the course, and that you're going to have these discussions throughout the course. Public services depends on public finance, and it also depends on having fair taxation. We cannot just come up with the money out of nowhere, or maybe some people will argue that we could, but in general, taxation is key. And often I think as unions, we run away a little bit from discussing taxation, and it should be front and center, I think, in our campaigns for public services. The third point is obviously employment and decent work. So we want to have good jobs, usually public transport jobs when they're in the hands of public companies are good jobs. They tend to be higher levels of unionization, higher wages than the average in the city. But we're slowly starting to lose that. When you hear a lot now of news that they can hire enough drivers, for example, for train systems or subway systems, that is a workers shortage. It often has to do with deteriorating working conditions. So this is something for us that's very important to highlight the working conditions in those systems. Fourth point, and also this is becoming more and more relevant. Also, as a union, we're changing to become, I guess, more uh, gender focused than what historically we've been. So the role of women in public transport, both as passengers and as workers. So increasingly, we are having conversations about how public transport systems are designed and operated mostly for men. And so, what's the role that women workers have in the systems? Why do we have so few women workers? Why we need to bring in way more women workers to the workforce? But also, what it takes to bring women to the workforce, to the kind of supports that they need. Um, but also as passengers, why are we thinking our transport systems as mostly for men in terms of the hours, the structures of the stations? There's so many things that come into play, and this is definitely an area where we as unions have to do a lot of introspection as well and self uh, criticism, because for so many years and still today we are male dominated. Most of our uh, main proposals target male workers, and this is something that at least in the public transport department we're trying to change, and it's part of what we fight for as well every time we make campaigns around public transport. And I'm going to just highlight the last two. One is the issue of technology. So we want worker control of technology, and that is essential because increasingly most of the new buses, most of the new transport systems are basically computers with wheels. And this means many good things. They are maybe more efficient. They may lead to less accidents because you have more sensors, because you have a lot more tools for a driver and for a worker. But they often also bring in a very negative part, which is the surveillance of workers. So, for example, if you're driving today an electric bus, you have a system that can even measure your heart rate and can say when you're getting tense and what kind of mistakes you are more prone to make when you're getting tense. All of that leads to a lot of stress on the workers, and often it can lead to penalties from the employer. So for us, having a conversation on what the role of technology is, number one is what kind of technologies we need. The second is who are the people and the workers impacted by this technology, and what are the reparations that we're going to give these workers. Another example is the ticketing system. So most transport systems are moving to having cashless tickets. So you can pay with your credit card, you can pay with whatever the city or national card is for transport. What that often means is that those jobs are cuts of those ticket vendors who are often women in most systems, most public transport systems. What we're fighting is to have those jobs reconverted into something else that can be useful for those public transport systems, like support personnel for emergencies or just for directing people to where to go, etc. But our argument is that we cannot just have technology replace workers when we can actually do both together. And that's also perhaps one of the newest areas. And then just the last one is again on the issue of climate change. In order to really fight the climate crisis in the transport sector, we're going to have to expand public transport, and not just expand it in the way that it doesn't compete with individual cars. We actually need to displace individual cars by bringing in more public transport. And this also creates frictions within our organization because we have workers who work in taxis, for example, or who do deliveries in small cars, or who, yeah, the basically rely on their lifestyle for the individual car. But the argument is that we really need a model shift. We need to make public transport more accessible, but also just make it dispute the same spaces that right now are so much dedicated to cars and to individualized forms of transport. So that's the 6 point: enlarging public transport, making it a big climate solution with all of the other conditions that I was just mentioning attached. So those are just the 6 points that are mentioned a lot in Alana's lecture. Um, but I think it's something that is resonating in many places around the world. So I'm gonna just briefly stop at that, and then just hear your comments or suggestions, and if not, I can continue with a few of the examples from the lectures.
Thanks very much, Bruno. Really, really helpful to actually provide also inspiration for the discussion now. So without any delay, who would like to make a first question or comment? Anybody has any immediate question?
Okay, how about we go the other way?
We have Nico, and I have questions too, Bruno. So there are questions for you. Nico, go ahead.
Hi, Bruno. Thanks for and hi everyone. Well, very inspiring and clarifying ideas, and they connect very much with what we've been talking. And I have one particular question that has to do also with what we discussed yesterday on jeepneys in the Philippines, and I'm very much supportive on displacing cars. I personally am a super biker. I defend. But we know how difficult it is to have alternative transport systems, especially in the global south, when that is very much attached to infrastructure and huge investments. My question is, are there any good examples of, let's say, let's not be so utopian in the sense of getting rid out of cars in the global south, but do you know of any good example of transformative investments that can at least increase the possibility of having an alternative transport system? The question is, we were discussing yesterday on jeepneys, but there's very little investment in railway systems in the Philippines. So do you know of a reasonable example that can be in line with the real situations and conditions in the global south?
Thanks, Nico. Yes, I literally want to take a few, or should I just go ahead?
I think perhaps we have this question because it's an important one, and I also want to add something to that. You mentioned also the possibility of free transport. And usually we are told that free public transport, and usually we are told that, oh, you have to be a rich country to actually afford that one. So also perhaps in the same line with Nico's question, what's your argument on that? We know that hundreds of cities have gone for free public transport. Is there any learnings or insights that you see from that process of countries and cities around the world? And then we take Luis.
Thanks, Elida. So first, to Nicolas, I think there's some good examples of countries investing a lot in public transport and basically divesting from cars in a way in the global south. It doesn't necessarily take so much the form of train systems, although there are some examples. So now, for example, you have a subway being built in Dakar, in Senegal, as an example. I think the most common form is bus rapid transit routes, which are very simple. one of the things that sometimes we get kind of stuck with is on how much money we need for something that we've actually done for over 100 years. We're not saying let's build a rocket and go to Mars. We're saying we just want more buses on the road, basically. Whether they're electric or not, that's a valuable conversation, but the main priority should be that we need to put more buses on the road and get more people traveling in buses. And this is something that any country can do. It is a political dispute. Often, I think, especially in emerging economies in the global south, a lot of the signs of whether a country is developing or not is how many people drive their own individual cars. So we see this, for example, in India, when you hear Modi talking about it, or any of the emerging countries, they do take a certain pride in it. But I think changing that logic is possible, and it is happening, especially in very congested cities that just can't handle any more cars as it is, and they've been forced to think about alternative forms of transport. So I mentioned Dakar. I don't know if any of you has been to Istanbul in Turkey. It is another example of a city that basically is really pushing for multiple integrated modes of transport, where you have the ferries, where you have the light rail, where you have subways, you have trains, and you have an amazing bus system, all of that integrated into a city. And it's not a particularly wealthy country. So I think the examples are there. I would say the main priority should be on, again, how we finance it, and it should not be through fares, but through taxes. And that's a discussion that any country can have. I mean, uh, our country, Argentina, is an example of that. We can, every time we have a tax discussion, it's very tense, but I think that's the only way we're going to do it. Unfortunately, a lot of the BRT systems are being financed through the World Bank. So they have this mode of private public partnership that is kind of ingrained in it. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge we have. On the other side, the ones that are often financed by China have, I mean, I don't want to say they have their problems, but one thing is that they do not condition how you are going to operate that. And I think that's it's a big difference for a country, on a city, on whether you have that condition or not, because it allows you to choose so many things that you might be restricted when you go more the World Bank way. And a little on your comment about free transit. So yeah, one of the articles I share is from Canada, and it's a discussion about fare free transit, or free at the point of entry, let's say, because nothing really is free. But could we use transport like we use, I don't know, lighting poles in the streets? We don't put a coin every time we want the streets to be lighted, or water. We don't pay at the point of use. And that's a big discussion that's happening. I think so. We actually don't have a unified position on it. I put it more as a discussion, and I would like to maybe hear what people here think. Here's my dilemma. Often, when you make it fare free, it rapidly increases use, and that's good. We want that of public transport. The issue for the worker side is that fare-free programs often restrict the budgets of cities to actually be able to take up the extra, basically all the extra usage that the system is going to have. So you are going to need more workers, you're going to need more maintenance, all your vehicles are going to be more used. We saw some of this with Germany when they launched the €9 ticket. That was 2 years ago, I think. And it wasn't for city, it was for countrywide, right? And the rail unions, both of them were, I would say, supportive in principle, but they saw what it was on the ground, and it was so tense for them. Because even though people may be paying way less, they expect the same level of service, and I think that's reasonable. So what happens in the context of austerity when we put in fare-free public transport, but there is not an equivalent, let's say, funding source to go and finance the requirements that system is going to have? What happens if we increase ridership by 30%? is fantastic. It's great. But that's going to have a need in terms of the system is going to have to be able to respond. You're going to have to need enough buses. So those are really challenging systems. I think there are some, especially European cities, that have done it. And I think they figure out a system of funding, usually through some form of common taxation at the city level. And that could be a solution. But it's not, it's also, when you look at most of the polls on users, most users of public transport want reliability and they want the system to work more than for it to be free. That's what most commonly happens. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight for free. I am in favor of it, but in as a matter of fact, most users just want the bus to show up at the time that they need it and to take them to where they need to go in the time frame that it's promised. That's basically it. Will the fare free challenge that? Not necessarily, but I think it is a tense question for a lot of the unions. A lot of our members say, well, that could be one of the things that will mean we don't have the same quality of the system. So it is a really good discussion, and we're still going through it. I think we've decided to go on a case-by-case basis. Depends on the city, depends on the context. Maybe we can phase it in. Some cities have free transit for kids, some all the way for students, university students, seniors, etc. But could we do it for everyone? It would just last thing one thing that will really change is it will stop the criminalization of poor folks who cannot afford the fares and often don't have access to a social ticket. And that is one big problem that we definitely have. So we don't want anyone to get a fine for not being able to get on the bus and pay the bus. Like, just taking a bus is not, that should not be criminalized.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruno. Perhaps we can come back to that if there are more questions. But meanwhile, I would like to first give the floor to Luis, and then we take the other questions.
I thank you, Delia. Nice to meet you, Bruno. I'm from Peru, but I live in the US, so I have two questions about each country or comment. About Peru, maybe you are familiar with since the 90s, we have we have for 10 years a dictatorship in the 90s in Peru who basically privatized almost all the public service, including transportation. And Fujimori, and he didn't just reduce the funding for public transportation, but he also changed the design of the city, basically making the public transportation less efficient. So then there was another reason to privatize, right? But what happened afterwards in the last 24 years is that we have these small companies with a lot of workers, usually underpaid workers. And when we have like a progressive mayor in Lima, or we try to make a progressive reform, to, for example, redesign the city again to promote public transportation. Those workers and those small companies are in the front line against those kind of reforms because they, of course, make profit. And it's interesting that we can see these working class people, or workers organization against public transportation because they benefit from those small companies. I don't know if that is just in Peru or that happened in other countries with a lot of informal transportation, but I would like to know your approach from the labor movement. That's one. The second is about the US. As you may know, Biden just passed a couple of years ago this Build Back Better law that promote the use of electric vehicles. And I think that goes to your first point that about one of the 6 points. The first one is about public ownership, but not running for profit. And you can see here in the US how is having the funds to promote private transportation, right? Instead of promoting public transportation. And I would like to know your approach about that, how other governments that have the funds decide to promote these kind of electric vehicles, but for public for private use, no more than the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. So I'm not specifically familiar with the situation in Lima in Peru, but from what you say, I imagine it's similar to other cities, especially in the global south, that are going through the same kind of transition. And why would workers oppose public transport? The problem is not opposing public transport itself. The issue is what you can say is the political economy of the transition. What happens in most cases in cities of the global south? You have, let's say, this is an example from Bogota, but I imagine it's very similar from what you said in Lima. You probably have 200 different companies running a semi-informal system of transport that kind of works because it services communities that otherwise maybe bigger companies wouldn't go to. Then the mayor comes and decides, no, we need to reorganize transport because we need to have corridors, we need to have clear routes, we need to have, you know, a clear system so that everything is better coordinated, right? With bigger buses, not these small buses that maybe are polluting too much, etc. So what happens in that transition is that often those workers from those 200 companies actually do not get rehired by the big ones for different reasons. One of them is that big companies, when they come in and they take those contracts, they often don't want workers that have they're used to a system of driving and of behaving on the road that is very much like a survival system. You're just trying to make it through chaos. So they might have a lot of infractions. They may have all kinds of problems with their record. So the idea is that these companies want to start anew. They want to hire their own workers, train them themselves, and start with their own workforce. So I think that is the main reason why workers from those smaller companies don't like that, because they know what's coming. They know they're going to lose their jobs often. And it's not, and then the second added factor is that often those workers, some of those small companies are cooperatives, some of them are unionized, and often the big private companies in public transport don't want unions either. So that's an added factor. What we've been trying to do is to work with those municipalities so that at least when they're tendering for those big companies, that there is no anti-union discrimination. So in the tenders, they say that they're not gonna fight a unionization effort. It's not always easy because most urban planners in working in city governments, especially the very progressive ones, do not like to think about unions. They like to think about electrification and more public transport, but they really don't want to think about workers and workers' rights. It's not a thing in that whole field of urban planning. So I would say that's the main reason why those workers protest. I will add one more thing, which is that often that also leads to a change in fares. Those changes, it becomes more expensive. So you also have most of the workers that run those informal buses are also passengers. So there is a double kind of identity for them. At least that's the experience from what I've seen. And in terms of the US, you're absolutely right. It's a massive program of funding that Biden has put forward that doesn't, in some cases, it does make like a mandatory that has to be aligned with public transport authorities and their decisions of whether they're public. They have the priority on how those funds are spent, but it's often leading to these kind of partnerships with the private sector, especially in rail. So you have a massive company called Amtrak in the US that runs a lot of the rail systems, a public company, but it's increasingly partnering up with private companies to develop high-speed rail or high-frequency rail, and that's definitely, I think, a big problem. The US unions are, especially the ATU, which is a amalgamated transport union, the public transport union, the biggest one, is fighting that, but is quite a challenge in the context of a very right-wing context in the US right now, even with Biden.
Thanks a lot, Bruno. I know there was somebody else before Ian, but I can't remember. So Ian, do you want to go ahead and then the person can raise the hand again?
Good morning, Bruno. How has the Federation dealt with the issue of informal sector in the transport sector and the challenge to the whole debate of people-centered public transport?
Thank you, Ian. So that it's an ongoing struggle. And partially what I was saying to Luis before about how those transitions happen in public transport systems, a lot of that is what happens to those informal workers in that context and how do we formalize those workers. I think the example from the Philippines, where we've been quite involved with the jeepney cooperatives, and I know we have an expert here, or many more since you had that discussion yesterday. But I think that's a good example of trying to, from what is existing already, instead of coming in and trying to change the entire form of employment and of relationships to the system. It's recognizing that right now, even though there is informal transport that has a lot of value, how do we formalize that transport? How do we give funding to those companies that allows them, for example, to run as co-ops to support those worker cooperatives that generally have better working conditions. So that has been one way to try to look at what's existing and basically engage those employers and the authorities to formalize the existing system without getting rid of them, which is, I think, the biggest priority that especially institutions like the World Bank have. The other part, when that's not possible, is how do we integrate informal workers and getting them priority for the hirings in either the new companies or the new systems. This is more common, I would say, in some of the African countries where we had bus rapid transits really come in and take over a lot of the transport systems in Nairobi, in Dakar, in Abidjan, in Cote d'Ivoire. So there, depending on the capacity to negotiate, what we do is pressure a lot the municipalities and also the big international funding institutions to make sure that there is a priority given to existing informal workers to be part of the new systems in whatever way we can make it. Sometimes it has worked. Sometimes, there's, as I was saying before, there are all kinds of objections that companies put. But those are the two ways that we try to integrate informal workers, but it's definitely a challenge, I would say, especially because a lot of these informal workers are also self-employed. They're not often directly employed by someone. They might run, like the case of the jeepneys, it was like 90% of them were owner operated. So it's one person that operates half of the time, maybe has one more worker for the other 12-hour shift. So also those workers often don't feel part of a collective. It's one of the challenges is creating that collective as well to make them integrated.
Thanks a lot, Bruno. So thanks, Ale, for reminding me it was Sabasara who raised his hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, over to you.
Good evening. This is Sarveswar from India. Actually, I have two questions. First, actually, we are talking about public transport. On the one hand, in India, actually in the major metro cities, we are encouraging Ola and Uber. They are the private parties. So, and people are also using these services because sometimes they are also providing cheap services. So, how it is impacting the use of public transport? This is one. And the second, in case of this rapid bus transit system that is also used in major metros in India, most of the workers are contractual. They don't have any kind of social security, and they have also long working hours. So what about the mental health? And in case of any emergencies or accidents, what about their social securities? What the union are doing or what we should do? These are my two questions. Thank you.
And one of these questions, Bruno, the last one also echoes the question that Kevin has made in the chat box. Really, what's the impact on this privately owned means of transportation? So I think you touched upon that, but perhaps you may want to pick it up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. And just by the way, one thing I forgot to mention is So I shared two articles. One of them is from Equal Times. Is the story of it's exactly the kind of discussion we're having. Is a story of an informal bus worker who, despite all the promises in the case of Bogota in Colombia, doesn't become part of the transition to the bus rapid system. And what's his impression, what's his life like in that context. So I encourage all of you to check it out because it's a good personal story. So I'll start by perhaps the first question that you asked about Uber and Ola, which is one of the big companies in India, but it can be Uber, Lyft in other places, Didi, depends where you are. These companies have different names, but it is one of the biggest challenges to public transport. Most studies have shown that they don't really take away passengers from public transport systems. They discourage new ones to join. So when we're talking about the model shift to public transport and having more public transport to take away space from individual cars, in that context of that discussion, what Uber and Ola and these rideshare apps do, they actually take those potential new public transport riders away from public transport and then back into individualized modes of transport, like taxi system essentially, and that creates other kinds of problems of congestion of.
You're muted, Bruno, for a moment.
Sorry, yeah. I think I was muted. So it creates other kinds of problems, working conditions for those workers. Obviously, this is the same everywhere. They don't want to recognize any worker. These companies, the whole format is everybody is an associate, and then they don't have employees, although they decide 90% of the things that those workers do in their day to day. So for us, the biggest challenge is that public transport authorities go through these phases where they become in love with ride sharing and they want to promote it, and they spend so much money on it in subsidizing ride sharing, and it really affects the funding that goes to public transport, but also affects the way the cities that we live in just operate. It's probably one of the riskiest, one of the biggest threats to public transport today is companies like Uber, like Ola, like Lyft. And they're not shy about it. I don't know if any of you have been in London recently in the last year. They have Uber Rail. And one of the largest divisions of Uber is called Uber Transit. And they're very clear that they want to start taking over public transport and run it like an app-based system. The problem, in itself, it's not a problem to have an app run public transport. Problem is how they are anti-worker, how they hike fares in the most when demand goes up, which is often as well cases of emergency. So it kind of defeats the entire purpose of public transport, and it's one of I think it's the biggest threat we have today. And it's for us, it's on the public transport side. It's also with the taxi unions are obviously it's an unfair advantage that Uber has, but it's very difficult to fight because Uber spends most of its money lobbying. Um, there was, and I'll share it. There was an interesting article that came out a few weeks ago about Uber's political machinery, how they enter cities and they lobby and lobby and lobby until they get what they want. They're very aggressive, and it's very difficult to fight them on that. So yeah, definitely that's probably one of the biggest problems. On the other part that you were saying around, I think it was just how the you know the stress and the precariousness combine. I think that's a little bit a question. Um, this is definitely one of the problems that we have increasingly, just in terms of the amount of things that workers have to do. It has to do as well with how a lot of the new systems in public transports have less workers and more technology, but that leads to often the point of contact still being, let's say, the driver of a bus that is not charging a ticket themselves. But if there's a problem with the ticket machine, they're the ones that have to deal with it, or they're the ones that have to deal with the passenger getting pissed off for that. Um, there is no more workers, for example, indicating where buses go or where you can switch, and it's often just screens. If anybody makes a mistake because they didn't understand it, they're going to blame it on the worker that's driving the bus or on the outsourced precarious cleaning worker whose sole job is just to clean the station. But they're maybe the only person, the only human point of contact in an entire station. This is very common in subways. You go to very touristy cities like Barcelona, they have one station worker every 4 stations. So if you're lucky and you happen to be in the station where the person is, great, you might get some direction. But if you're in the other 3 stations at the time and you need to know what line to take, and in the touristy city, it's so common to see thousands of people asking the same question, it often goes to the more precarious workers who have to deal with that. Even though it's not their function, they're not paid for it, and often they're not even equipped to deal with that. And we see similar things in the other modes of transport. Often, for example, when you switch from informal to a formal mode of bus, most informal buses usually had 2 people, the driver and then someone that does the ticketing or maybe yells the name of the stations they're going to or does both. So that stops existing when they move to like a bus rapid transport system. And again, that often puts more pressure on the driver, who is the one that has to deal with all of the miscommunications that happen. And that happen on daily basis for very normal reasons. In big cities, people get confused. It happens. So it's one of the biggest issues that we're seeing now from our members. Mental health, it's probably the number one issue that comes up of the so-called new demands, but where people are more willing to talk about it, especially coming out of harassment and especially coming out of increasing technologies in transport systems that leads to more harassment to workers. And this is worldwide, not just in some cases.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bruno. On this last point about the mental health of workers, I thought it was very interesting, the point you're making about how the technology is there to actually survey workers, but with the purpose of penalizing them rather than supporting them, or like trying to prevent accidents and trying to find the conditions that actually lead to so much stress at the workplace. So are there examples where trade unions are taking up this one? Say, how do we make, I think the point you're making is not workers against technology, but how do you use technology to support workers in the process? So could you provide a bit more insight on that? And there was a question from Monirul from Bangladesh on the question of PPPs in public transport. We have discussed the question of PPPs in several conversations. Naturally, it does come, as we know, that's been a major recommendation of the World Bank. But whether you could expand a bit more on that, like what are your examples? To what extent do they really meet the promise that they make of investments and then, increasing the quality? And then I think you mentioned the question of rising fares, but if you can provide a bit more general overview on what do we see when it comes to PPPs in public transport.
Sure. So on the issue of surveillance, I'll give again the example of Chile. And actually, the person in the video from Chile is one of the people that led the effort in the collective bargaining. They have a clause now in their agreement that says that any new technology that is going to be introduced in the subway needs to first be discussed in advance with the unions, and they need to analyze what are all the potential impacts on workers and on the service before introducing it. And I think that's one of the first examples that we have of making that effort way ahead of time. Because the concern was exactly that. Okay, we have new technologies that are necessary and are good to run a more efficient system. For example, new signaling and, as I was saying, camera, sensors, etc. But how much of that technology points towards the worker, and what does it mean in terms of the worker's privacy as well? It's not just about control, it's also about the privacy of the data that the worker generates when they're attached to so many technologies. And this is, for us, has become a major issue. What happens with the data that workers produce? And we're trying to get more and more unions to fight for privacy of that data so that the companies cannot use it, especially to penalize workers in different contexts. The best example, I think, of the use of it does not come from transport. I'm just gonna share it to you. The U.S. women's soccer team, the football team, they actually have one of the best collective agreements in terms of what happens with the data of all the footballers. They have all these tools that they use to measure performance. So when you use it, when you're training, and they use it, how fast you run, what's your heartbeat, etc. And the union fought very hard for the workers to have the final say on how that data is used. So one thing is for the US Federation to use the data to improve the performance of the team. Another thing is for Nike to use that to develop a new product. And it was a very clear distinction. And although it's probably, I think it's one of the few examples I know, for us it's similar, that discussion. Are we using this data to improve the public transport system, or are we using it for Uber to design a new format in their app that is not necessarily going to improve the system, it's just going to increase their profits? So those are, I think, the discussions that that we have. And there was one more point that I forgot about.
On the PPPs.
PPPs, yes. So no, they're just a complete, I'll just say it, they're complete bullshit, to make it in simple terms. So the promise is they're going to come and it's going to run this shiny new system that is so much more effective than the public sector one. What often happens is that you end up with the public anyways footing the bill, so we have to pay for all of that, for more expensive services. And very, very often PPPs fail, even recognized by the World Bank itself. They fail to deliver. They end up leaving countries, leaving cities, with the systems being abandoned, and then you have to, who takes over is the public, the state. I think PPPs are, the whole narrative is effective at the beginning when you have a poorly run public service that has been defunded through austerity policies for many years. Then they come with these bids, and maybe for the first year or so, you see like new shiny equipment. Let's say you see a few electric buses, and everybody's excited. Then when the cost starts coming up, then it becomes a big problem. So I would say in no way there is any evidence that PPPs work better, especially in something like a public service. It should not depend, again, on a company making a profit out of it. And as long as that's the logic of PPPs, of the private partnerships, public partnerships, then it's not going to work, I think. And we're going to continue seeing this system fail. But we have the good PPPs, the public-public partnerships. So I know PSI has talked a lot about it, and you maybe you talked about it in other lessons, but there's so much knowledge in the public hands already, and we could do partnerships between a public transport authority in one country with a public transport authority in the other, without the need to privatize any systems along the way.
And we call those PUPs, public partnerships. And
PUPs, okay,
yes,
good to know.
yeah, there's lots of work on that, not just in between the public utilities, but also involving communities and trade unions. What we call bottom-up public-public partnership, and really harnessing the knowledge of communities and of workers, and actually strengthening public transport systems, but not just in different public services. Yeah, there were a few other questions from Celine and Arlene, but you responded to those, Bruno, in this conversation. So we've got a couple of minutes. Is there any other final question or comment that you would like to make to Bruno? Yes, Monirul, do you want to say something?
Yes, I have a very little question to Bruno. All of we know ITF is a global network for the transport workers. What role will we play in globally to promote the public transportation? Actually, could you please?
Yeah, I mean, we play that role in every space we can. So we go to UN meetings and try to push governments to commit to more public transport. We pressure. So as workers have their global institutions, employers also have that. So we often are pressuring employers to promote more public transport, not to privatize services, pressuring cities when an affiliate is going through a struggle, we support them either with examples or by going to their national government. Um, I would say, is the bread and butter of what we do, Monirul. It's just bringing the need for public transport to every possible space that you see internationally. Increasingly, that's happening in the climate change conferences at the UN level. That's really where a lot of those discussions are happening, and we're present in those discussions. We bring in our points from the public transport side. Also, though, you have to think that the ITF is not just public transport; it also includes other sectors like aviation, like maritime, and for them, especially for aviation, the conversation about climate change and what should happen with that industry is much more difficult, right? There are no electric planes that can fly from Washington to London or from, I guess, Dhaka to London. So that's a different conversation in that industry, and we are crossed by those contradictions. But in public transport, it's a very, I think, consolidated message that we bring. And I'm happy to share more resources on some of those things, Moniru.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruno. Bruno, we've got just a couple of minutes, perhaps just in time for you to highlight some of perhaps the most important message that you would get from the case of Bogota that is also included in the transport chapter. We couldn't have a conversation with the speaker because of the language barrier, but it would be great if you could also give us what is the most important message out of that and what are the prospects of that case, which is really interesting actually in terms of the future of public transport. And you mentioned some, but if you can use that also as a way of wrapping up.
You mean Bogota or the Chile case?
The one we have in the course.
The video,
yes.
Yes.
So it was the, yes,
Chile. Yeah, because I just shared the article on Bogota. I think the example from that is that although it might seem like a unified force to an outsider, in reality, public transport modes are very separated. So buses operate in one way, the unions in buses operate in a very specific way, the unions in subways in a different way, the unions if you had in light rail will be different. And I think the example from Chile is really an effort to bring all of that together, and from the union side to tell governments and employers we need integrated transport. It should not make a difference whether you're getting on a bus or you're getting on a subway. You should have an integrated fare. Workers should be under the same good working conditions. We cannot have very precarious bus workers while we have like well-paid, highly trained subway workers. And I think that's an effort that is pretty unique, and it comes from, ironically, it comes from a union that is doing really well. So the initiative of all of that is from the subway union. So it's not the more precarious unions asking the subway union, can you back us up? It's the subway union saying, we want to bring you along with all of the benefits that we have because we fought for them. We want as well to expand it to especially the bus sector. So I think it's a pretty unique case. And they're now looking to have a national collective bargaining, which will be as well fairly unique, given how decentralized often public transport. I just think that it's mostly city authorities that decide on public transport. So with this network, what they're trying is to have a conversation that leads to a national collective bargaining between all the unions and the national government on public transport. So I think it's a great example, and I'm glad that it was included in the course.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's also especially important because it is one of those examples where the stronger sections of the working class are really standing in real solidarity to actually lift up all the workers and provide their bargaining power to also strengthen the bargaining power of less. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just one more thing on that case, because I think it's something, maybe I'll share the article. Very briefly, during the Chile elections in 2021, where it was a very right-wing fascist candidate and a center-left candidate, the government actually tried to cut down the buses for the election day. The government at the time said, look, we're going to cut down the services, etc. And it was this network of unions that came out publicly saying, bring the buses back because we need to take people to vote. And it made a huge difference, especially in working class areas, for people to go vote. So I think it's an example also of politicizing workers beyond their workplace.
Fantastic. And yeah, great conversation. Thank you very much, Bruno, for the time. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for very insightful and interesting questions, which made the conversation even more informative. So